So this is the biggest laugh of all.
So the real point of the golden pizza is that it's emblematic of the fact that the extreme economic inequalities of our society are laughably unjustifiable. If I were to translate the meaning of the golden pizza into an argument, it would go something like this. Capitalism as we know it is a defective economic system.
The idea that capitalism is a defective system, and this is the concession.
Because, although it's good at creating large amounts of wealth,
but apparently it distributes this
in an incredibly inefficient way.
Well, that's rather quite laughable, because nothing can rival free market capitalism for efficiency. And the reason for why that is because capitalism is not faced with A, the knowledge problem, and B, the economic calculation problem. Now, this is something that I am going to discuss critiquing another YouTuber on the economic calculation problem. If you destroy market-driven prices, which is to say prices that are determined by consumer demand, which requires a capitalist system, in other words, a free market economy, for the free market to determine what prices are through consumer demand, that's market-driven prices. If you distort market-driven prices via socialist price controls, aka government price controls, then you end up destroying the information of profits and losses. When you destroy the information of profits and losses, you can forget efficiency, because without the information of price signals, without the information of the profits and losses, there's no possible way for you to know all the valuable information, to know what resources to use and where to allocate them, etc., or even how much to produce, etc., etc. You don't know the information. The reason the capitalist system works so well is because there is no incentive for a producer to produce goods that are not going to sell. Why would they want to do that? If the goal of private business owners is to make a profit, they're not going to produce what is not selling. Why? Because it's going to make them losses. So what a producer does is the goods that are not selling, they stop selling it. That's an efficient way to tell them what resources to stop using and, of course, what to stop producing. So they efficiently know where to allocate resources, what to produce more of, and what to, or how much to produce. They know where it's going in the market. They know what is in demand. Whereas they know that from what is not in demand, they know where to stop allocating the resources, etc., etc. Whereas socialism is not driven by consumer demand. Socialism's driven by what it's defined by. Economic central planning. The idea that you can place the consumer secondary and that you can just centrally plan the economy, centrally plan production. As if the central planner knows the needs and wants of 70 million people in Great Britain, ignoring the fact that out of 70 million people, they all have different needs and wants from each other. Imagine trying to, plan production just for one type of product for, 70 million people. Not everybody likes the same stuff. That's the issue. You've got a very complex society. It's not as simple as just, producing and throwing it out there in the market and hoping for the best. You either have this idea of the Marxist theory of a moneyless based economy, which means you have no price system, and if you've got no price system, you've got no information of profits and losses, so you don't know all the valuable information. If it's not the moneyless based economy, and from what I gather from ContraPoints' argument, this individual seems to agree with a money-based system. So what's ContraPoints saying? ContraPoints is saying, on one hand, they want to abolish the private sector, right? But they want a money-based system. So if they want a money-based system, what are they going to do? Well, what do socialists famously do? Socialists resort to government price controls. And what do government price controls result in? It results in shortage problems through price ceilings, it results in surplus waste problems through the price floors, and it results to the misallocation of valuable scarce resources. That's gone way past theory, by the way, because we've got mountains of historical evidence to back it. It's been proven everywhere. You've seen it with the mass production of pelts in the Soviet Union. You've seen it with the mass production of shoes in the late 1980s. You've seen it with the food shortage problems in Venezuela. You've seen it everywhere. This is the problem with socialism. It's destroyed on the economic calculation problem alone, never let alone arguing on the knowledge problem. So it's completely false to say that a capitalist system is defective and somehow is inefficient. How can someone claim such a thing? The style of economy that we live under today, whether you talk about that of Great Britain or the United States of America, that's not a capitalist system. That's not a free market. How can anybody say that today's economy is something capitalist when we're sitting here with a central banking system, when we're sitting here with the type of economy full of government subsidies? They were bailing the banks out, for crying out loud. That's not capitalism. And as far as I'm concerned, if you wish to try and connect a mixed economy to capitalism, you're basically stating a fallacy.
Where efficiency is understood not as the capacity to maximize total wealth, but as the capacity to maximize human happiness. Now I need to explain what I mean about happiness. Here's a question. Should the economy serve humanity, or should humanity serve the economy?
And again, ContraPoints really proves the point that this particular individual really doesn't understand efficiency at all. It's not about this to do with human happiness. It's about how you can maximize productivity out of using the fewest resources as possible. A great example in that in history, and again I provided a video on that you can go and watch, that I explained on Standard Oil with John Davis and Rockefeller. He was the perfect example. This was a man utterly obsessed with that of efficiency, and he achieved what he got. He maximized his profits whilst minimising the use of his resources. Efficiency isn't doing what the hundreds of other oil refinery companies were doing. And what were the hundreds of other oil refinery companies doing? They were wasting vast quantity of natural resources, and they were being punished for it. The reason why John Davis and Rockefeller managed to benefit from it is because, again, in the laws of supply and demand, as more and more people entered the oil refinery market, the price would drop by about 50% on the barrels of oil, and these companies could not afford that because they were so wasteful. That's why they couldn't afford it. Meanwhile, because John Davis and Rockefeller was too smart for them, because he was far more efficient than them, he was gaining more money out of the whole thing. That's not a case of unfair practice. That's just a case that you have one businessman who's far smarter than the rest of them. So he deserved where he got. So that is an example of what we call efficiency. It's not this idea of something to do with human happiness or something.
It seems obvious to me that the economy should serve humanity. So what I look for in a good economic system is that it produces the most happiness for the people who are a part of it. So if you're willing to go along with this, the first question we should ask is, does having more wealth make people happier? And we actually have data about that, at least within the context of our own economic system. And the data shows that more income does lead to more happiness up to a certain point, but the happiness benefit of increased income plateaus somewhere between $65,000 and $95,000 a year. One interpretation of the reason why happiness increases up to the threshold is that at lower income levels, more income means less stress about paying rent or mortgages or medical bills or college tuition.
Through a free market economy, you actually see wages drive up and the inflationary rate of the economy drive dramatically down. So therefore you end up living under a low inflationary based economy where everything becomes cheaper, and of course people become wealthier as their wages grow. This was precisely what we saw from historical evidence in the late 19th century when there was only small pockets of poverty left behind. If you were to contrast the poverty of people living in 1760 in what would become the United States of America, if you were to compare the people living back then in the 1760s with how poor they were, and then contrast that to how people lived in the 1880s onwards nearer the 20th century, you will find that the vast majority of American people had been lifted out of poverty, and the most important thing out of this fact is the fact that, again, as I've pointed out before, between 1840 to 1900, the consumer price index continuously dropped. And back then, you had free market healthcare and education that was dirt cheap, and you contrast that to the corporatism that you live under today.
So at least to my naive eyes, what it looks like is that millions of people in this country don't have enough money to securely afford food, housing, education, and healthcare.
The very fault of why American healthcare costs are through the roof, I have explained in detail about this, is because you're living in the absence of capitalism. That was the fault of all the socialist government interventionism that restricted supply and increased demand. That is the laws of supply and demand that you can't ignore. You can't ignore the American Medical Association monopoly. It's a bit like that funny cartoon where, the socialist sticks something like a stick in the spokes of the bicycle and goes flying over the handlebars and says, "Oh, capitalism's fault." You complain about the house costs. You complain about all of these problems. Meanwhile, you're sitting there with a central banking system that controls and manipulates interest rates, for example, artificially lowers interest rates, resulting in consumer demand driving up in an area of a shortage, and before you know it, you end up seeing house prices soar out of control. And even as a result of all the lack of, proper immigration controls, you see more and more people flooding into the United States, and even for Great Britain, for example, and therefore you see housing costs drive up because, that's the laws of supply and demand. You then have all the regulation and the taxation in certain places that end up driving up food costs, because if you restrict productive output, you're going to see the costs drive up. That's not a case of greed. That's just a case of the laws of supply and demand. How do you solve the problem of healthcare in terms of costs, or education in terms of costs, or anything else for that matter in terms of cost? How do you solve that problem? Well, it's the laws of supply and demand. If you have more in productive output in ratio to what is in demand, if you produce more, demand drives down. So the cost drives down. That's how you reduce the cost. So how do you reduce the cost of education? Simple. You create more placements available for students. That's how you do it. You build more schools. It's not because of greed. It's because of the laws of supply and demand. It's because of what government's been doing, basically. It's the government that restricted supply and increased demand. A good example of that was the American Medical Association, and even the closure of all those medical schools. And what did that result in? Well, in 1996, there was 44,000 applicants who applied for medical school, but there was only 16,000 placements available. So is it any surprise why the cost of medical school is so expensive? It's expensive because that's the fault of the government-granted, created monopoly. How can you blame that on capitalism? This is the point. If you're not going to take it seriously, if you're not going to acknowledge the laws of supply and demand, how can someone take you seriously on your arguments about costs when you don't even understand prices? It goes off in this tangent again to speak about today's economy, ignoring the complex argument, ignoring the fault of why you have this problem with housing and food and, all the other stuff to do with education and healthcare. That's the fault of all the government intervention. That's the fault of the mixed economy. That's the fault of living in the absence of a capitalist system. In other words, a free market.